By any assessment, John Cheever is one of the major contemporary figures of English literature, and he's achieved that status without compromising along the way. When he was kicked out of prep school, he taught himself what he needed to know. He began writing professionally when he was still in his teens, and he's been at it ever since. When he could hardly support his family through writing, he kept on writing, knowing that they would suffer. When he became modestly successful, the backbiters said that his characters were trivial and irrelevant. He never answered them except by writing what he wanted to write. For a long time he left the country when his books were published, so interested was he in not hearing what people had to say. Now, with the publication of his fourth novel, Falconer, about the imprisonment of a man who has murdered his brother, John Cheever's name is established in the literary firmament. In its cover story, Newsweek called Falconer a great American novel. Other reviews followed suit. Does Cheever, now in his mid-60s, at last pay heed to what's being said about him?
Well, I think it's enormously gratifying that a novel, or that a series of books, actually very serious, books dealing with the known and the unknown, with otherness in our experiences, should have been received by a large audience, and by an audience that is, I think, marvelous, because it can't be identified by computers. I think it's the only book buying, the serious book buying public is the only public that has what they call no demographic image. I think these people is living in the woods somewhere. I know that they're either educated or self-educated. I know, of course, that they're discerning. I know that they're responsible. I know that they have the price of a hardcover copy of the book. And I think, truly, that these are the people who keep the world from flying to pieces.
Your first reputation was that of a short story writer. And although you have published a few novels, I think your short story reputation preceded you. Now, people don't tend to buy collections of short stories, do they?
Publishers always claim that the collection of short stories doesn't sell. My last collection of short stories, called The World of Apples, I think sold between 40 and 50,000, which is a very respectable sale. Publishers have, as any businessman does, a series of misconceptions. Writing, of course, is original and never fits quite gracefully into the business world. I wrote in the short story because at that point my emotions, my involvements were characterized by their interruptive and intense nature. It was not until I'd been married for, I believe, 16 years that I felt that I grasped, that I comprehended a lengthy, a sustained relationship, and that was when I wrote my first novel.
A
sustained relationship.
What you're saying is that big equals big. A big understanding equals a lot of pages.
Yes, a sustained narrative. A sustained emotion, of course, is reflected in a sustained piece of work. And an intense and a broken relationship is best handled, of course, in an intense and broken form.
But what you are best known for, I think, is your ability to describe a moment or a fraction of a moment, the detail.
Well, I would like to think that the stories, I believe there are 200 short stories, and there are only 4 novels, so perhaps it's the question of numbers.
One of the recurrent themes in your books is I'm talking about short stories and novels as well, is the theme of being trapped, imprisoned. Of course, Falconer is the name of a prison, which is a central piece of concrete in your new book. But in other books and stories, there is a bomb shelter, there is a missile base, a boy in Bullet Park who's trapped in a bed. What is the function of this consistent metaphor?
Well, it seemed to me the best metaphor, for me, the most natural metaphor for what I consider to be the mysteriousness of life. That I started out in the village of St. Bartol's, which is the sense of confinement to a provincial village. In fact, the sense of the provincial village is, in a sense, a metaphor for the past. I used the sense of confinement. I've written about American expatriates in Europe. Here again, these people are in an intense confinement that is, as I believe all confinement, is characterized by its ambiguity. They have left their own country. They complain about the country in which they live, as a prisoner will complain bitterly about his incarceration, and as we all know, the percentage is very high of those who, upon being freed, will then find their way back into prison. It is the mysterious and fascinating paradox of our drives that is, for me, best expressed by confinement.
And then, of course, everybody who is confined has an urge to break out of confinement. That goes with it, doesn't it?
Yes, of course, it's simply the other side of the coin. Confinement very clearly enunciates freedom. One wouldn't grasp freedom, of course, unless one had the relative of imprisonment.
Did you feel confined as an individual when you were growing up? Is this a part of your experience?
I don't think I felt uncommonly confined. I know the taste of confinement. I know the pain of confinement. And there are times, of course, when one is quite literally confined, such as the elevators in Eastern Europe, or being in a plane where there's motor trouble past the point of no return, or in an erotic contract, in an emotional arrangement that one can't get out of, and one would love to smash.
I'm just thinking that it's only fairly recently, I think, in the last few years, that you have finally shed an image that I think must have bothered you very much. And that was that you were writing about a group of people who really didn't matter, that they were superficial people, that they were suburbanites, and they didn't really have much to say to the rest of us. Now, I think you're certainly with Faulkner, that's behind you. No one is going to accuse you of that anymore. But it must have felt good to get out from under that.
Yes, I was delighted to get out of being characterized as the man who went around who went around on Sunday morning looking through the garbage pails of Saturday afternoon cocktail parties in the suburbs. A characterization that I thought grossly unfair. But the suburbs, at least when I first attacked them, it was very much sitting down.
When you say attacked, you mean in the sense of treated them?
Actually, it was an attack. It was virtually libelous. That these were men and women who were concerned with being, warm in the winter and cold in the summer, and educated and feeding their children, struck me as secondary. Well, of course, it is their principal. These are their principal characteristics.
What comes through, in a way, despite what we've just talked about, is that I think you do have a great respect for traditional values.
Yes, of course I respect traditional values, but firstly, I love working in the language because it is the medium of communication we have, of course, that has inalterable traditional values. The words we use in fiction to describe the pain of love and the pain of death are precisely the same words we use in the purchase of an airplane ticket or a simple salutation. I enjoy abiding definitions of good and evil. Since one's life cannot be an improvisation, one has to inherit a degree of values, and it seems to me that one cannot improvise in the space of a lifetime a clear sense of what is good and what is evil, so one must cling to traditional values.
I discover with astonishment that you used to write for television. You wrote some episodes of Life with Father.
I simply wrote a pilot for Life with Father and walked out of the first story conference.
Why?
I think there were, as there very often are on television, something like 5 opinions. And I was asked to change lines, to alter a character. And it was long ago I got up and said that if I was to rewrite Mr. Day in the light of X's, Y's, and Z's opinion, it would be an impossibility, and I walked out of the conference, and that was the end of that.
And that was the end of your television career?
That was the end of my television career.
How about movies? Now, a movie was made of The Swimmer. Any others?
No. Hollywood has taken options and occasionally bought a story. My feeling is that no one of my generation, that is the generation that was brought up in film, has written a first-rate novel that can be made into a film. People name Deliverance as an exception, or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. None of the novels of Saul Bellow, obviously our leading novelist, have ever been made into films. This is also true John Updike, Bill Starr, and the disciplines are vastly different.
They've been made, but they've also failed.
They've not been successful, and I mean on the question of merit. They've not been successful film.
I wonder why not.
To write a screenplay is as unlike writing a novel as changing a tire. You're working with camera. You're working with very sophisticated camera now. A line spoken, a line written, and after Altman, a line mumbled are all very different. If one writes, if I wanted to write a screenplay, that's what I would do.
You wouldn't write a story?
I wouldn't write a story, yeah.
Well, the Swimmer has been described as an interesting failure. Will you buy that assessment?
Yes, it could have been. It could have been a much better film than it was. The best example, here again, it was a question of producers, directors. It was an unhappy synthesis of talents. A great many people had their finger in the pie, and people, of course, with the greatest power, were able to impose their taste on others.
Well, how did you feel about Burt Lancaster as the man who swam across one swimming pool after another on his way home?
I thought Burt did a splendid job, and I can't think of anyone else who would have done better. I think the conflict, I had nothing to do with the film. I appear in it briefly. The principal conflict was, or the conflict upon which I parted on, Frank Perry shot the film in Westport, shot it very blue. Burt was painted gold every day. It was a very gaudy film. And Frank and I decided to use Miles Davis improvisations, that Miles Davis tapes, and Davis is around. And this is going to be very funky late-night music. And it was wonderful against this blue film with Lancaster swimming. And we suggested this, and Sam Spiegel said, no, I wasn't going to do that at all. That he had commissioned a symphony called the Swimmer Symphony, which was played by a full orchestra and was very bad Verdi.
I must tell you that you got me into trouble the other day because I quoted you in a conversation with a journalist. I quoted you as saying, in fiction, facts are used to create a mood. And my friend the journalist said, why, that's wrong. The responsibility of facts is toward facts.
Well, there are very few stubborn and irreducible facts, and there are fewer stubborn and irreducible truths, of course. Fiction, one would like to think, deals with truths. Truths, of course, are a sum of selected fact.
But would you change a fact? Would you say something that you know to be factually untrue in fiction in order to create the proper mood?
Well, fiction is full of all sorts of unrealities. Angels appear in fiction. Voices from the past speak. The whole sense of time is not the convenience it is in reality. One would not distort a fact. One would simply eliminate a fact, perhaps. Well,
I'm really thinking, of course, it's true that if you're going to talk about switches in time or heaven and hell, you have to deal with more than what we know to be fact. But I'm thinking of some of the modern writers who have taken real historical figures and put thoughts in their minds, words on their lips, caused them to commit actions that they never really did, and then said, well, this is a greater truth. What do you think of that?
It is a new element. It is something that I can't recall having been done in the past in literature. Tolstoy writes battles, which he didn't participate in, and changes the course of history slightly. So I believe does Stendhal.
You said that you don't consider fiction to be a competitive sport. Well, I understand that you said it, and I appreciate your saying it. I sympathize with you to a certain extent, but I must tell you that you're the only writer I have talked to, among many, who feels that way. And I think most of your colleagues are out there, comparing themselves to each other.
We do compare ourselves to one another, but not what one can make comparisons without. These are not competitive comparisons. Saul Bellow is a dear friend. John Updike is a dear friend. Are men who I think are not competitive. Of course, John is 20 years younger than I. If John is splendid, I am enthusiastic, not only for his giftedness, but for the welfare of literature in general.
You really don't feel any competitiveness with anybody?
I may not be replying to you honestly, but it is my considered feeling that I do not.
You talked a moment ago of the fact that you grew up in a fairly stratified society. In the time that you have been writing, and you have been writing professionally for more than 30 years, things have changed. Barricades have fallen. Taboos no longer exist. How has your output, how has your literary output sensed this, reacted to it?
Well, I don't want to speak, use a chestnut like enduring values, but the values that are important, it seems to me, have not changed greatly.
More language is accessible to you now. More subjects are open.
Yes, there has been a wonderful broadening of the language, and a number of taboos have changed, at least superficially. On the matter of sex, for example, the 18th century novel was by implication quite candid, and in many cases much randier than some of the dirtier fiction we have today, much more persuasively randy. The whole sense of love and friendship and anxiety about death is what it seems to me principally concerns the writer, and these, of course, have not changed.
I'm just reflecting, you sound like a very well-educated man, and in fact you are. But I think it's true that you did not have a formal education.
No, I was expelled from secondary school when I was 16. However, before my expulsion, I had 3 years of Latin, 3 years of French.
Why were you tossed out, by the way?
I was smoking. It used to be an expulsion offense.
And you never couldn't go back? Didn't want to go back?
I didn't particularly want to go back. Smoking was very serious, and I suppose it will be again. Now, if you were caught smoking at school, I think 3rd offense, and you were out.
In retrospect, did it do you harm or good?
I expect it was a very fortunate. I could have gone on to college. I could have gone into Harvard as a special. I didn't want to.
Why not?
Because I was quite happy with what I was doing. I was quite happy as a writer.
But you had an extraordinary early success. You began selling your stories when you were still in your teens.
Yes. But a good many other writers have been equally successful, I think. I think Carson McCullough's first novel was published, and a splendid novel it is, when I think she was 20, maybe 21. Yeah, I don't think it matters whether you start to publish when you're 16 or whether you start to publish when you're 36. Some people don't publish when they're 60. You do it when you're ready to do it. And since it's not a competitive sport, it, at this point, doesn't seem to matter terribly.
Can you give us a sense of what's next from John Cheever?
I can tell you that I am working on another novel. I feel, and I think most writers do, that it is extremely unlucky to tell anyone the story. And when I wanted to write Faulkner, I was damned if I'd tell anyone what it was about. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was in a prison. I was just going to write a story. I wanted to write a novel. And people do understand, I think, because it's generally accepted that writers are absurdly superstitious about talking about a work in progress.
What was your mood when you were writing Faulkner?
It was very somber. I was terribly happy working on it, and I worked very hard. The book was written in less than a year, and of course was much longer than the final form. I started working on it in May and finished it, I remember, on Monday, Thursday. Things were rather tense around the house. Everybody knew that Farragut was in jail. I remember running out of the house one day and shouting, "Hey, Farragut's going to get out." And my daughter said, "Well, how's he going to get out?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I know he's going to get out." And everybody around the house was cheered up. And then when I finished a long section, I would read it aloud to the family on Sunday evening. And since it was to be dedicated to my son, who was then 18, and since it dealt with drug addiction and homosexuality, I was very anxious that he should approve of it, and he did enthusiastically.
Why were you anxious for him to approve of it?
I wouldn't have wanted to enter college as a freshman, known as the son of a father who specialized in drug addiction, fratricide, and homosexuality.
Last question. I read that earlier in your life you didn't like meeting people, you didn't give interviews, and now here you are. You're very forthcoming, very helpful. What happened?
Oh, I'm not quite sure what happened. I like to think that I matured. No, I was very cranky. I give one reading once a year and regard the people who bothered to put on a dress and come and hear me read with contempt. I always left the country before a book was published and didn't return until some months after it had been published because of my claimed indifference to reviews. I wanted to pursue a rather lonely way as a writer, and it has occurred to me recently that I am as dependent on the reader as the reader is upon the writer. I now enjoy very much reading, and anyone who is kind enough to want to talk with me about my work, I consider courteous and friendly and would like to respond in the same terms.
So John Cheever is moving in two directions. On the one hand, his books are getting tougher, harder, dealing more and more directly with the desperation within the straitjacket of our society. On the other hand, the author himself is becoming almost mellow.